Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how do an athlete's action capabilities, for example, their speed, power, and movement time, influence their abilities to perceive affordances and make decisions? How well calibrated are these things? Can we improve perception and decision-making by increasing action capacity? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. One of the key principles of the ecological approach to perception action is that we perceive the world in an embodied action-scaled manner. That is, our capacity to act on the world shapes our perception of affordances and the decisions we make to realize them. In today's episode, I want to start by reviewing some sports-related research that has investigated this idea, then discuss some implications for coaching. In particular, how we might better connect strength and conditioning training, which if done right can increase the relevant action capacities, and skill training. As we will see, this difference between action capacity and skill is really important to consider when we're designing training programs, as it affects how we view them in terms of their representativeness. The first paper I want to look at is one published by Matt Dixon colleagues in 2010. In this study, the authors examined the task of a goalkeeper stopping a penalty kick in soccer. In particular, they were interested in looking at the relationship between the action capacity of the keeper, that is essentially their diving speed, and the time at which they initiated their dive during the shot. Quote, following Fajan's model of affordance-based control, if a goalkeeper's timing of movement initiation against a penalty kick is constrained by their action capabilities, it is plausible that slower goalkeepers may be forced to couple their movements to earlier penalty taker kinematic information compared to faster goalkeepers. Such action boundaries may predispose slower goalkeepers to lower levels of performance accuracy, while also increasing their susceptibility to deception. End quote. So the idea is that your action capacity not only influences the control of action. If you dive at a slower speed, you're going to need to start your dive earlier. It will also have an associated effect on the available information. Like with many actions, in a soccer penalty kick, the information about the precise location of the shot is not specifying until later in the event. Earlier in the kicker's run-up, there are only advanced cues from body language which don't specify the precise location and can also be used to deceive the keeper. Another example of this is in baseball batting. The higher bat speed you have, the longer you can wait to start your swing, giving you access to different information as compared to a batter that has to start their swing earlier because they're slower. In their study, Dixon colleagues filmed 7 experienced goalkeepers stopping 20 real penalty kicks. Of course, a key point here is that if you're going to take into account action capacity, you have to keep perception and action coupled. Using a lab task where the keeper says left or makes one step to the left in response to a video is a completely different animal because you've totally changed their task requirements and constraints and the information needed to achieve the goal. In 10 of the trials in their study, the kicker was asked to be deceptive and fake a shot to the opposite direction they actually kicked. At the end of the experiment, baseline movement times, the action capacity, were measured for each keeper by having them dive towards targets suspended in the corners of the goal. To determine whether the goalkeeper's movements were scaled to their action capabilities, as predicted by affordance-based control, the authors calculated a pi number. This was something first developed by Bill Warren in his 1984 study of stair climbing. A pi number is a unitless ratio of an information source and an action capacity of the performer. So in Bill's study, the pi number was the ratio of the riser height of the stairs, which gives you information, to the leg length of the climber, their action capacity. The key finding from Bill's study was that across a range of different individuals, of different leg lengths and heights and so on, and stairs of different sizes, there was a constant pi number for judging the affordance of climbability, suggesting that the perception is scaled by our action capability. An important difference from Bill's study to the ones I'm talking about today is that we're not just considering scaling according to one's body dimensions, like leg length, but actually to a motor ability, like the ability to move in a certain amount of time, which should be much more complex and much more variable. In this goalkeeping study, the pi number was the ratio of the baseline diving time, the action capacity, to the time to contact at which the dive was initiated. So, for example, if my diving time was 650 milliseconds and I started my dive at 700 milliseconds time to contact, that is the time it's going to take the ball to get to the goal, the ratio would be 0.93. The key predictions of their study were that goalkeepers with faster baseline movement times would wait longer and start their dive at a shorter time to contact, and that across all the different keepers, each would have a constant pi ratio, indicating their perception and action was scaled according to their action capability. What was found? As predicted, there was a significant relationship between baseline movement time and the time to contact at which the dive was initiated when stopping a kick. Goalkeepers with faster baseline times started their movement later at a shorter time to contact. Importantly, this had a direct effect on performance. The 3 goalkeepers with the fastest movement times, who started their dive later, were the only ones in the study that successfully saved a deceptive penalty kick. With the exception of one participant, variations in the timing of the diving movements were action scaled for all of them. That is, they had a constant pi ratio across different kicks. Interestingly, all the pi ratios were greater than 1. In other words, the keepers were initiating a dive when there was not actually enough time to get to the ball based on their action capabilities. As I discussed back in episode 142, this is not what you would predict based on Fajan's affordance-based control model, in which it is proposed that performers act so as to keep the required action within their maximum capability. That is, keeping it within an achievable action boundary. So, for example, when I run to catch a fly ball, not only do I couple my running to the information from the ball, but I also make sure to keep the required running velocity less than the maximum velocity I can produce. That is, I keep the pi ratio less than 1. So in other words, I'm using both information and the perception of the affordance of catchability to guide my actions. This issue of goalkeepers having a pi ratio greater than 1, that is diving too late based on their action capabilities, was recently further investigated in a study by Zheng and colleagues. I did a video review of this paper, which you can find on my YouTube channel. In Zheng et al. Studies, the authors used 8 experienced goalkeepers and varied the distance the shot was taken from and the run-up speed of the kicker. Again, it was predicted that diving time should be captured by a constant pi ratio regardless of these other factors. Their study revealed 2 interesting main findings that built on Matt's work. First, the best keepers in their study did not seem to be initiating their dive based on the time to contact of the ball, but rather coordinated their movement relative to the kinematics of the kicker. Specifically, they started their dive when the kicker's non-kicking leg struck the ground during the plant for the shot. Second, they again found that the pi ratios for all the keepers in their study were greater than 1, indicating that despite years of experience, they were not effectively calibrated to their action capabilities and were diving too late. So what is going on here? Consistent with the conclusions from Dixon et al. Study, the authors propose that it's not a flaw or ineffective calibration, but rather the keepers are intentionally diving too late due to the constraints of the task. Unlike when catching a fly ball or braking a car, the task Brett studied, there's no specifying information about the precise location of a shot early in a penalty kick, such that, even for the fastest goalkeeper, there's not going to be accurate information available they can scale their dive to their action capability and keep a pi ratio under 1. So, they wait a bit longer to increase their chance of diving in the right direction. While this might not get them there in time to stop a shot put right in the corner, it could give them a chance to save one that is a bit inside the post. Quote, "The goalkeeper's adoption of an intentionally late strategy may have been utilized to detect more useful information from the penalty taker's kicking action to regulate the direction, left or right, of the diving action." End quote. In fact, our observations point towards an alternative strategy. In absence of timely specifying information, goalkeepers may have adapted by coordinating the lateral dive onset to the landing of the kicker's non-kicking leg. They then have attuned to non-specifying information of the kicking leg placement next to the ball as the best available information to trigger the dive and go for the ball as fast as they can. Presumably, the less skilled goalkeepers in our study have not yet converged on this strategy. It may be possible that the moderate skilled goalkeepers took a bolder strategy and simply waited longer than the high skilled goalkeepers and more highly prioritized spatial information. End quote. So what we're seeing here is that the perception is action capacity scaled, as predicted by affordance-based control, but in some situations the constraints are so severe that we cannot act to keep things within our safe action boundary. For more on this, please check out my YouTube review of the Zheng study. The next study I want to look at is one published by Bruce and colleagues in 2012, looking at the sport of netball. In this study, the authors recruited players of 3 different skill levels and asked them to perform 3 tasks. A test of motor skill, that is having them try to throw a ball to different distances and locations on the court and measuring the accuracy. A test of perceptual skill, that is having them try to decide where to pass by making a verbal response when watching a video of an unfolding play. And third, a coupled perceptual motor task, in which they actually had to execute a pass on the court to the best option during game play. The main prediction was that the motor skill, the action capacity of throwing, would constrain decision-making. That is, less skilled players that could not accurately pass a ball to a player a long distance away would perceive that option as not being an affordance, so they would not choose it. More specifically, 58 female players were recruited. The 3 skill levels were expert players from the Australian national team, developmental players, which were members of the 17 and under National Talent ID squad, and lesser skilled players, which played in community leagues. For the motor task, participants completed short, medium, and long passes towards the image of a player projected on a wall and were given a score based on accuracy. During the perceptual task, participants viewed a life-size video of an unfolding play projected on the wall while wearing an eye tracker. It was predicted that along with decision-making, players' gaze behavior would be constrained by their action capabilities. That is, lesser skilled players should spend less time looking at the long pass option that is not achievable for them in the video. Scores on this test were based on how well the players' verbal responses matched the best option as decided by a group of coaches. Finally, for the in situ perceptual motor task, 8 skilled players acted out different patterns of play, replicating some of the basic scenarios shown in the video. When they received the ball, participants were required to execute the best pass option, as if they were playing in a match. Performance in this task was assessed in 2 ways. First, decision-making, did they choose the best option, again relative to coach's opinion, and second, execution, did they make an accurate pass to the player they chose. From this, a final score, the percentage of trials in which they made an accurate pass to the best option, was generated. What was found? In terms of overall performance, the pattern you would predict was found. Experts were better than the other groups in all of the tasks. They could throw farther more accurately, made more optimal decisions in both the video and gameplay. Interestingly, the experts also showed a significant improvement when switching from the uncoupled video judgment task to the coupled gameplay, which the other groups did not. Finally, there was no real evidence to support the prediction that decision-making was constrained by action capability, as lesser skilled players selected the long pass options in both the video task and actual gameplay as often as the more skilled players, irrespective of whether they could actually accurately pass to that distance or not. Furthermore, there were no real differences in terms of where the players of different abilities looked on the court. The only effect was that experts tended to shift their gaze more often than lesser skilled players. So again, we see here that there does not seem to be this simple relationship between action capacity and affordances that we see when we look at body scaling effects like in stair climbing. One possibility is that it just takes longer to calibrate an action capability, like the speed at which you can dive or the distance you can throw, because these are highly dynamic variable abilities. The final study I want to look at today is one on climbing by Van Nobelsdorf and colleagues, published in 2020. In this study, the authors examined the relationship between the action capacity of fingertip strength and the choice of route and movements of climbers. The key pi ratio here is between the capacity of fingertip strength and the hold size. Climbers with greater strength are able to use holds with smaller surface areas, so they have more affordances available in terms of routes across the rock face. To investigate, the authors presented a group of climbers with routes of increasing difficulty, so that they would all hit their action boundary at some point. To quantify this, they used a measure called sample entropy, which is essentially a measure of predictability. When entropy is low, things are very predictable. They measured this in two different ways. Gaze transition entropy, when you look around, how predictable are your eye movements? As John Alsop and I found in a study on pilots, when you give a trained performer a task they have performed multiple times over and over, gaze entropy is low. For example, pilots follow a very predictable pattern in moving their eyes from one instrument to another in a cockpit. In this climbing study, gaze entropy was measured while the climbers previewed the route they were going to climb, looking from hold to hold. The second entropy measure was a motor version, specifically the displacement of the hip as it actually went across the rock face. So again, if a route was very easy for a climber, we would expect they would take a very predictable route from one hold to the other, resulting in low entropy. To pull this all together, the authors measured the fingertip strength of 20 climbers of different skill levels. They then used this to calculate the pi ratio of the strength to hold size. The basic prediction was that the entropy in both gaze and movement would be related to how close the climb was to an individual performer's affordance boundary. Specifically, when the pi number is well below 1, which means that all the hold sizes are large enough for your fingertip strength and you're well away from your action boundary of not being able to climb the rock face, you should have low entropy. You should scan the rock face in a very predictable way and take a predictable route as you go across it. Similarly, if you're far away from the action boundary in the other direction, the pi number is way above 1, meaning most of the holds are much too small for your action capability, you should also be very predictable. In this case, because there's just a small number of options and affordances available to you. But when you're near your affordance boundary, with a pi number close to 1, we should expect high entropy, because you need to choose between the options which afford climbing and those that don't. For the study, participants had 2 minutes to preview their route and were given no explicit instructions about climbing technique or which holds to use. What was found? As predicted, there was an inverted U relationship for both gaze entropy and hip displacement entropy when plotted against the pi number. There was also an overall relationship between fingertip strength and entropy. That is, weak climbers tended to have low entropy, moderately strong climbers had a high entropy, and very strong climbers had a low entropy. Again, this is what we might predict because it's the moderate strength climbers that are going to be closest to their affordance boundaries under most conditions. The weakest climbers were not able to perceive ways of adapting, changing their action during route preview, and consequently showed a simple visual search pattern, a low entropy. Very strong individuals, the entire route is well within their capability, so they do not need to search for alternatives and again have very predictable scanning patterns and low entropy. In the author's words, quote, in some, visuo-motor complexity, as measured by entropy, was positively related with fingertip strength when acting near the individual's performance limits. The findings of the study suggest that climbers account for affordance boundaries when searching for solutions to climbing problems. The complexity of visuo-motor behavior seems to be influenced by the sensitivity to changing hold difficulty relative to fingertip strength. End quote. Along with the results demonstrating the link between action capability and perception, I think it would be interesting to use these entropy measures for other purposes. In particular, they're a way to quantify whether you're challenging a performer at the optimal level. Relatively high entropy, when you're close to a performer's action boundary, is where you want to be if you want to push the performer to improve. So to sum up, the studies I reviewed today do show some evidence that our perception and decision-making is scaled to our action capacity. However, not surprisingly, it doesn't seem to be as simple as the story we get with scaling to body dimensions. But either way, there's a really important implication for coaching from all this. Increasing action capacity, strength, speed, movement time, flexibility, etc., is far more than just quote-unquote physical training. It has direct effects on the information that a performer can use to control their action and the affordances they perceive in their environment and their adaptability. To quote the last paper, another issue is to establish in what ways functional strength supports a greater variety of actions, including adapting to more complex or difficult movement problems. For instance, does improving an individual's functional strength enhance capabilities to overcome more challenging environmental and task constraints? And if so, which it presumably does, is this because functional strength increases functional movement variability? End quote. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts or work one-on-one with me, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.